You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. This week's guest features a former Navy SEAL with multiple deployments overseas who currently runs one of the most important veteran nonprofit organizations out there. He's the communications director for the Navy SEAL Foundation. We'll get to that story coming up in just a few moments. First, our normal announcements. Please follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Give a thumbs up and a like to the content there. As well, continue to leave us reviews on Apple Reviews, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a thumbs up, 5 stars. Tell us why you love the show. We certainly appreciate it. Want to remind you guys as well that we have some sticker swag. If you guys are into some swag, we have some stickers for you. So all you got to do is hit us up on social media or on our website, hazardground.com. Send us your address, and I'll send you guys out some stickers in the mail just to continue to show some love to the Hazard Ground community. So also on our website is our Amazon promotion. Go to the bottom of the homepage on hazardground.com, click on the Amazon button. It'll redirect you to Amazon. You do all of your normal Amazon shopping. We'll get a percentage of what you guys spend, and then we'll donate a percentage of that back to some of the charities and organizations you've heard featured here on the show, like the Navy SEAL Foundation. So please, a great way to help out all veterans charities by just going to hazardground.com first before you do your Amazon shopping. With that out of the way, this week's guest is a former Navy SEAL, graduated from the Naval Academy, actually one of the top graduates at the Naval Academy. Spent a total of 20 years in the Navy in special operations between active duty and reserves. He went on to have several titles post-career, including being the president of Killcliff, a company we know well here at the Hazard Ground. He is currently the current communications director, the current communications director of the Navy SEAL Foundation. As well, he's a singer-songwriter whose original works include the score and song Sacrifice from the film Murph the Protector. If you've guys seen it about the Navy SEAL Michael Murphy, who received the Medal of Honor. Of course, you know that movie that we've all seen, Lone Survivor, that is about Michael Murphy as well. And he is Chris Irwin joining us here on the Hazard Ground. Chris, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So Navy SEAL singer-songwriter. I just always put those two together in the same sentence. Not really, but it's great to have you here. And look, some background here on how Chris and I connected, because I always think this stuff is important. I had a friend who was in trouble, and she was married to a former Navy SEAL, and I had reached out to a couple of people, and they had put me in touch with Chris as a former Navy SEAL and the foundation to help them out. So the Navy SEAL Foundation, one of those amazing organizations that helps their former warriors in all sizes, shapes, and forms. So, and then after talking to Chris for a little bit and doing a little research, I'm like, wow, Chris has got a pretty good story. So we want to hear about it. So again, thank you for your help. It's great to connect with you. And you and I, when we started talking, remember going back to our Killcliff days when I think we spoke back then. It was
I think so. Yeah.
I think we had a chat back then. We didn't do it here on the Hazard Ground, but I think we did it for the Killcliff podcast.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I thought you meant informally. No, you're right. At some point we did. Yeah, we did do something like that. And I don't remember. Yeah. I think there were multiple people on that episode, right? Yeah.
So we have crossed this path before, but now we're here to hear your story. And it starts back at the beginning. I mean, I told you went to the Naval Academy. Was that something you always wanted to do? I mean, was that what you had your sights set on, or where did that come into play?
Yeah, I always tell people I'm a member of the Top Gun generation. So I saw Top Gun when I was 11, I think, and just thought, well, that's really cool. Like you can do that as a job. I don't come from a military family really at all. My grandfather was in World War II, but drafted into it. So I don't have some long lineage of military family members, certainly not my immediate family. I'm just somebody who, again, I saw that movie and I was like, that's cool. That's really kick ass. I didn't know you could do that as a job. And so from that point on, it was like, well, how do you do that? And my father, I think, was really excited because if I went to the Naval Academy, he didn't have to pay for college. So to him, it was great. Let's go look at the Naval Academy. So I went and looked at the Naval Academy, and there was something about it that always appealed to me. It was I think the structure and the discipline and sort of the cleanliness, like I'm a very sort of clean, fastidious type of person, and that order and discipline appealed to me. And I liked trying to find the most difficult path too. I liked that. And so even though that my initial idea was, hey, I'll go be a fighter pilot. Like when I learned about SEALs, it was like, oh, that's even harder. Like that's even cooler. Let me go in that direction.
Yeah. What you realize is like the hardest part of being Tom Cruise in Top Gun is just actually flight school. Like after that, it's not really, difficult.
I don't know anything about being a pilot.
Neither do I.
I know plenty of them, but I don't know at all what that's like. Yeah. Nor would I want to. I mean, I think the funny thing for me now is like, flying doesn't appeal to me. I don't even really like flying on commercial airlines.
No. Yeah.
So the idea of doing that as a career now in retrospect is like, why would I wouldn't want to do that. That doesn't even sound good.
Yeah. Flying commercially doesn't appeal to me at all, but that's basically because we suck as American flying. Like we're just the most idiotic people. Like I've always said, flying brings out the lowest common denominator of stupid in everybody. People act like they've never been in an airport before.
Oh, yeah. Well, you mean passengers.
Yeah. Like, I guess if it was just like you and I in a plane and you were flying and I was sitting behind you, like, okay, all right, that might be.
Yeah. I think those scenarios go into the airport or wherever it may be, where there's a lot of people in a big process is just, it's an opportunity to improve your mental health. It's an opportunity to like, see if you can be compassionate and patient. And because I'm with you. I mean, yeah, like you're sitting there and the person who doesn't know, like, do I put the shoes in does the laptop come out? Right. Like all that stuff. And you're sitting there rolling your eyes going, come on, really, dude? Like,
but, not paying attention to the TSA agent who's going next.
Right.
And I'm like, dude.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perspective.
It tries your patience. It's a good opportunity. It's a learning moment.
Yeah. See, that's the difference between. That's why you're a Navy SEAL and I'm not, because you look at that perspective and go, this is a great opportunity for learning. I look at this and go, all my stress is going to do is go through the roof. Like I'm punch someone.
And look, I'm not saying I'm good at it. I'm just saying that is the attitude we probably should take.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go for it. So you graduated at the top of your class. Like, I mean, you said you were very, disciplined and fastidious and everything else. Like, was that a goal? Like, did you really say, hey, I'm going to be one of the best midshipmen there ever was, or it just sort of worked out that way?
No. I mean, I think I was always a good student. Just kind of naturally. And I don't mean that to sound arrogant. It's just like, that was like, I was good. School was kind of something that came fairly easily, I guess, getting good grades.
Oh, I can relate.
And no, it's an interesting thing I talk to my kids about, which is like you have the ability to do really well in school. Most people. It's just a question if you want to do it or not. And I think sometimes we succumb to ideas of, oh, I'm just not that smart, or I'm not that good, or blah, 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 whatever. And I was kind of like an A-B student. And then my sophomore year, I got straight A's, like by accident. I didn't really try to do it. It was just that I got a 4.0. And I remember looking at that and thinking, okay, you can do that. And it was sort of just one of those things where I had some self-reflection of, all right, you're capable of that, even if, so you can't settle for less. And that was my attitude going forward. So it went from just trying to get good grades and like be a good student to, well, now you can't settle for anything less than a 4.0 because you're capable of it. And I think that was a really valuable lesson for me, because I think it's applicable to a lot of people in a lot of things, is that you're capable of more than you think you are. And the question is, do you want to apply yourself? So from that point on, I was like, I can't get anything less than this.
And, again, I would say that mantra served you well in the SEAL community. How much are you capable of, really? That's sort of the test of the whole deal, right? Like at least getting through buds is do you really know what the limits of what you're capable of are, and how much are you willing to test them?
Well, I think it's applicable to anything. It's like, what are you, that is something for everybody to search inside themselves and figure out. If you want something, are you capable of it? Now, I think the question becomes like in the things, sort of the content that I put out now that's geared towards mental health and mind fitness is there's other pieces to it. I think that there's a lot of talk about sort of mental toughness. That's a really like prevalent topic out there, right? Of just like that idea of just like be tough and go. And the sort of content that I'm doing personally now is geared towards, okay, like that's great. I think that's a really good message, but there's sort of other pieces to it when we're faced with some of these kind of like mental health challenges that it's not actually always about get up earlier, go faster, go harder, do more.
Yeah, no, I get it. You mentioned that you sort of came across the whole Navy SEAL thing. Now, again, time frame wise, you had graduated from the academy in a pre 9/11 world. So
yes,
the idea of, hey, special ops, hey, do cool stuff, hey, kick down doors and go find bad guys wasn't really prevalent in our minds. So how do you get this idea of, Navy SEALs and special operations? When do you come across it? Because correct me if I'm wrong, at the academy, it's not like they necessarily publicize it all that much, or at least didn't back then, right?
Yeah, I don't know what it's like now at all.
Well, everybody knows it now, right? Like it's just like a common thing.
Yes, yeah, and it certainly wasn't back then. It was more steeped in mystery and mystique, and there were various books out there from the Vietnam era, a couple of them that you would come across. There was the movie with Charlie Sheen that people had seen, but it was very much like you just didn't know a lot about it. And again, I think that was part of what appealed to me I always tell people it was like the closest thing you could, in my mind it was the closest thing you could get to being like a superhero. And it was like, well, that's cool. Again, like I want to go be a superhero, right? And you don't even know exactly what it entails. You sort of can glean some things out of various sources, but not highly publicized. So, but again, it was just the challenge of it appealed to me.
Did say have somebody come in and speak to you, or did you?
No. I mean, it's look from a service selection standpoint, it's just like any other service selection you're going to do. It's just like if you want to go be a ship driver or a pilot or whatever. I mean, there's still people there that, we talk about that path, and there's certain wickets you have to do to qualify for it. And, in that regard, it's the same thing. It's just less people are qualified and less people go do it by a lot.
So after you graduate, what's the timeline like? I mean, do you go right to buds? I mean, for you, and again, this is a pre 9/11 world, so I'm trying to, remember how things would go.
Well, yeah, typically you would. I went to graduate school for a year, so I went overseas, and I went to England to Cambridge for a year and got a master's degree, and then I went to buds. One
of them smack kids.
Yeah.
So you're a 21-year-old kid hanging out in England.
Yep.
That's an awesome experience.
Yeah, it was awesome. It was interesting because it's I think back on it now, and it's funny. Anytime I think you go to something completely new, if you know absolutely nobody, it takes some getting used to. And I remember the first couple of weeks over there, I was actually a little bit kind of homesick and depressed even. Then things changed completely once I got in a social circle that was fun. For me, that was the modern pentathlon team, which I joined because it seemed like a good thing for training to keep me kind of physically active, even though I would have done that on my own. But there was running, there was swimming, and then there was these other elements. There's like this air pistol thing that you shoot, and then horseback riding and fencing, which were skills that I had no experience in. But that group was super fun and just a great group of people. And it was the teams that were co-ed in the sense that we would practice together, compete separately, but the men's and women's team would train together. And man, it was just so much fun. It was such a great experience over there. Really enjoyed that year.
Horseback riding and fencing, how British and regal of them.
I know, it really is. Yeah. It's again, nothing I ever would have chosen if I had had an a la carte menu of here are the things you can try and work and compete at, or never would have chosen that. But it was cool. It was like something interesting to learn to do. And I don't think I was ever really any good at that. But again, it wasn't so much about the sport even. I think it was about the community. And I think that's also a really important lesson, is that experience over there could have been really sort of about book learning and studying, and I did all that. But what made it memorable and special for me and enjoyable was the people that I was with.
Sure. No, absolutely. You went to Buds after your time over at Cambridge. Did you do a lot of reading up on the whole process, or did you try to go in blind?
I don't know about reading up. I think just physically trying to be prepared was the biggest thing.
I mean, what did you know about the whole Buds process heading?
Oh, no, I knew a fair amount.
Okay.
There's a program run through the academy, or at least there used to be, where you kind of like, they exposed you to the training modalities to the greatest extent that they could. So no, like I felt like I was as prepared as I could be.
When you get there, is your level of preparation matching what you're looking at?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think to the extent that you can. Yeah, I think so. Sure.
What was the hardest part about Buds for you?
I think the joke is the hardest part is getting up every day. It's like every day when your alarm clock goes off, that's the toughest part. It's just being tired and cold and wet. That's what makes it difficult. It's just, you're very, very tired and very, very cold and very, very wet for a very, very long time. And that's what's challenging.
A lot of the SEALs and former SEALs that I've talked to, and again, people who are fans of the show have heard me ask this to all of them, because I'm always curious of their perspective. But some guys have said, I could handle all the physical stuff easily. I was never worried about that. I was just mentally worried about, how I was going to handle each day. And some guys said, mentally, I was fine. I just didn't know if I was going to be able to hold up physically. Which kind of category were you in?
Yeah. Okay. So that's an interesting point, and it really speaks to some of the content I do now personally, which is it's interesting that people separate those two, mental and physical, because in my estimation, everything is mental. It's like the way you experience something physically is mental, right? It's a mental construct. Anything you feel is a mental construct. If you didn't have the consciousness to experience that, you wouldn't feel it, right? So to me, it's all mental. The reason you decide to pursue that kind of path or decide to go to the gym, that's a decision. That's a choice, which means that's a measure of mental discipline, even in that moment. Your decision, like if you're super uncomfortable, again, like super tired, like what keeps you there, like the pain, you say it's physical, but really it's mental. Like that's how you experience it. So I think what people worry about potentially physically is just sort of like breaking, like if you break a bone or you get injured or something like that, right? And that's, hey, there's nothing you can do about that. So to me, it's 100% a mental thing, 100%.
Were there guys who, and this is another question I ask a lot, because the experience to me is just unreal. Were there guys who rang the bell and dropped that you were shocked that did it? Or were there guys that you looked at it from the beginning, like, I don't think there's any shot this guy's going to make it, and all of a sudden they're the ones standing at the end?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I think that goes back to it being a mental thing. And the fact that, look, if there was a scientific, like biological way to pick anybody for any kind of thing that we think of as sort of a physical discipline, whether that's some sort of special operations unit or a sports team or an Olympic athlete, we would do that because it'd be easy. It'd be like, hey, we take a blood draw and it's like, these are your guys. Like you got it, you didn't, right? Simple. We have to do long crucibles like that because it's the only way to sort of test people's mettle. mettle, right? Like their character and their capacity. And that's not shown by what they look like or even their physical fitness scores or anything like that. There's standards you have to meet. And I think that's true. And I think that's valuable. You need that, obviously, for any type of job, whether it's special operations or cops or firefighters or any kind of first responder, anything like that. There's like, okay, we've got a physical standard. You have to meet that. But outside of that, it's like, as long as you pass those standards, everything else is not something you're going to see on the outside. It's not something that's revealed in test scores. It's like dealing with that person, it's seeing how they react to hardship, seeing how they react to when the chips are down. Like, are they the type of person that is selfish, or are they selfless, right? Are they going to help somebody else before they help themselves? Those types of things. And I think, quite frankly, if you go through any type of crucible like that, it's going to teach you something about yourself too, where you might flounder in some way, shape, or form along those lines and realize, ooh, hey, I was kind of selfish there, and I need to be like more selfless. I need to kind of help the team before me.
Was there ever a moment you thought that you weren't going to make it?
I can think of one moment where I thought that, just randomly. I don't know why it sticks in my memory. Where I thought I might quit. I think it was a pretty fleeting moment. Look, I think anybody.
What were the circumstances around?
I don't know. I think it's funny. I'm not even sure it's accurate. Like we tend to think our memory is super accurate, and this is another thing that I talk about. Like, we think of our memory as sort of this file cabinet where the files are all tucked away, and it's like, hey, we want to pull a file out, and it's a carbon copy of what happened, and it's not accurate at all. That's not the way memory works. We sort of rebuild them when we think of them. When we do that, they get a little bit altered every single time. So even though we think, oh, this is exactly how it happened, like that's not true. So I just had this like flash of this moment where I was, sort of like out there in the water thinking that, but it passed. I don't know. I was, in that moment, I was like, super tired, uncomfortable, cold, and it's like, but I've had that about anything. I think my first couple of weeks at the Naval Academy, I wanted to quit. I wrote a letter to my father that was like, hey, because again, I didn't come from this sort of rich tradition of the military. And right. So I was kind of a fish out of water. I came from a very liberal high school in Massachusetts, private high school, where nobody went to the military academies. And so I was weird in that regard. All my friends were off at, other sort of liberal arts colleges around the country. And here I am at the Naval Academy doing the military thing. And it was a real culture shock. And I wrote this letter. I don't know if I still have it, or if maybe my mother has it. That was like, hey, I don't know if this is right for me. I hope I'm not letting you down, blah, blah, blah. And my dad wrote me back a letter that I do have. And he just said, hey, you're never going to let me down, but make sure you're not letting yourself down by doing something like this. And then he had this quote that he always said, which was, take your responsibilities seriously, yourself not at all. And I don't know if he came up with that or if that's something he stole from somebody else. He probably stole it. I'm sure it's not an original thought. But it was like, keep your sense of humor, which is to say, like, objectively look at what you're going through and just realize you can kind of like just laugh about it. And you, amazingly enough, as miserable as it may be, like, you can laugh about it. There's those, like, is it the 13th Warrior? You know that movie, 13th Warrior, with Antonio Banderas, where he's like the Muslim dude that's with the Vikings. Like, it's a John, I can't remember the author's name, but it's based on the Eaters of the Dead, I think is the name of the book. Anyway, those guys, when they show these Viking guys, they're out in monstrous seas, swells, storm, it's freezing cold, and they're laughing on the ship. And you just think, God, these guys are tough as nails. But it's sort of like okay, let's use this, like, let's laugh right now, because why not? Anyway, the end of that story is, he sent me back in this letter, my father, this note that said, it was that like sense of humor, don't remove under penalty of law. And he made it into one of those mattress tags. You know how mattresses have that thing that says like, don't remove under penalty of law. So that's what it was. It was like a fake mattress tag that said, don't remove under penalty of law, sense of humor. And I just thought that was awesome. And so I don't know if that's what kept me going, but yeah, I thought that was a good message.
That is, that's incredible. So many of us don't have, or I don't know how many, but a lot of people don't have that sort of father mentor to be able to give
true.
Those little pieces of advice that would just push you a little further along.
Yeah.
And it's funny because again, you led with, I don't want to let you down. And, his response was something that sort of just motivated you in the opposite direction. And it's just, that sort of connection, I think, is always foundational in making great leaders, right? Like you come from great people. You come from people who are helping you build a foundation of leadership at a very early age, even without realizing it. And it manifests itself down the road, right? Because that little lesson that at times when bullets are flying or whatever, or the mission is really tough, you look at your guys and say, hey man, don't worry about it. We're going to laugh our way through this one. So,
look, I was very lucky, like in terms of my upbringing. It's like, I didn't come from a ton of money or anything like that, but in terms of a stable home life and good parents and, no abuse or anything like that, like extremely lucky. And there's people out there that are not. In fact, I'm constantly amazed now how much I learn about people whose home life as children was not good. It's almost like it's more prevalent than a stable kind of good home life or upbringing, which is terrible.
Oh yeah.
But it does seem that way to me now. Like I just meet more and more people who had some kind of abuse as a child, or whether that's abusive parents or some other kind of abuse. Like I just did a podcast episode of my own podcast with Chris Henderson from 3 Doors Down, who just divulged this awful childhood of abuse. Man, what that must do to you, right? Like when I think about kind of my own mental struggles that I go through, I'm like, man, I didn't deal with anything like that as a kid too. And I'm just not knowing even how to process stuff like that, which I just can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's sort of a vicious cycle, which, sucks. You have a divorce rate that skyrockets. Then you have kids who spent, a lot of time missing a lot of emotional things that they needed. And subsequently they became parents. And then when they had kids, they focused on themselves and needed more time alone away from their kids to get their mental. And then we substituted that with technology to give kids to babysit them. And lo and behold, they're immersed in that now. And now you're trying to break another cycle that's gone along. So, there's my sociology lesson.
Right. Yeah. Right. I know. And I have no credentials to back any of
neither do I,
but I'm saying, so yeah.
Well, I talk about my kids a bunch, here and there, but the main goal for me is to fill all the voids that I had in their life and make sure that they don't have them. Right. Like, whatever, if you got something good as a kid, like you did, you want to magnify and multiply that. Like I always say, when I say leadership starts at the top, and I when I talk about leadership, I say subordinates will always magnify and multiply what leaders do. That means when I say that they'll multiply it, they'll do it at a wider level in front of more people, and they'll magnify it. They will actually take it up a notch. So you sort of move that line, and then the line that you cross, they'll cross it a little bit further down the road. So that's the magnify and multiply thing. And I think the same thing works on a positive end, right? If you're getting positive reinforcement, you magnify and multiply it more around you, and that becomes infectious. So I think that's why I just, you shared that story. I thought it was amazing. Let's get back to sort of your timeline here. You graduate buds in 99, and again, 2001 doesn't roll around. Just in that short period from where you graduate buds and you get to a team, like what happens prior to 9/11? Anything interesting?
No, I mean, excuse me.
I mean, it's training, obviously, but like, we're not, nothing's really kind of going on, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, and like we've talked about, I don't really get into many specifics from my time on active duty. I just think that that's kind of should be kept close held. I don't see the big. It's just a personal choice I've made where the thing that started making me want to become a more public voice. Like I wouldn't have done this podcast, I don't think, at all, like 6-7 years ago. I was really like, hey, just be private about everything. The thing that made me want to be a public voice was my veteran experience, my sort of mental health, chronic illness journey, and what I thought I could bring to the table there to help other veterans. And that's what really started making me want to talk more. And obviously the work I do at the foundation too, right? Like I think that sort of, they go hand in hand a little bit. They're not directly, there's no actual official tie there, but just trying to give back to the community. I mean, that's what I did at Killcliff. That's what I try to do now in various ways. So yeah, I just don't get into too many specifics about
Sure. No, and that's fair. And let me approach it from a different angle then. Let's take that. Where are you on 9/11?
Training.
Okay. So, I mean, were you one of those guys who thought immediately, okay, boom, we're going? This is the call we've sort of been waiting for?
I don't know what I thought exactly. I think I probably just thought, okay, things are going to change for sure. And I got calls from people, like I think my immediate family kind of called me, and some friends as well, thinking about that. But yeah, I think my thinking was things are going to change.
You did multiple tours overseas throughout your time in the SEALs. Obviously, that includes, a combat experience. You talked before about, everything physical being mental, right? Yeah. And the experience of combat, and this sort of leads into what you talked about with your mental health and post-traumatic stress and everything else.
Yeah. Yep.
I'd like to look at it through that lens of your combat experience, because I think it's, one obviously one obviously precedes the other. It's a causational relationship.
Yes, for sure. Yep.
Not the other. So, in your experience, since you had no combat experience prior to deployments, but you train at such a high level to sort of simulate that feeling and everything else. When you get to combat, and you sort of have to put yourself in the game, so to speak, right? You call up to the majors. How much of a gap was it from what you thought it was going to be to what it was?
Well, I think let me start speaking generalities here. I think just like anything, the challenge with any type of training modality versus the real thing, so to speak, I think, again, is sort of like you're saying, it's the mental approach, because it's really hard to mimic the what's the right word here? The nervousness, like the tension, the feeling of like, this is real and I might actually die here. Trying to mimic that in training is really hard. Like, I don't even know exactly how you do it. So that's true with a ton of stuff, I'm sure. Like, let's go with a sports team, same type of thing, right? Like, so if you think about how you apply that idea outside of the military, it's the same type of thing. You can practice and get really good at all the skills and everything, but when it's like game 7, 5 seconds on the shot clock, okay, the skills are there, but do you have sort of the wherewithal and the presence of mind to stay calm in that moment? That's the real trick. I coach little kids, God, they're not even little anymore. I'm coaching teenagers at this point, but soccer, that was my sport. And the times where it's the most nerve-wracking, where it's all on you and the game's on the line, is if you have a penalty kick, right? Whether it's a shootout or just a penalty kick in the game, that's probably the most stressed you ever are as a soccer player. And we practice that in practice. It's like, we'll line up and take penalty kicks. But I'm always struggling to figure out how you create the tension, how you make it feel like it's all on the line here, because it's just so different. It's so different.
Right.
And I think that's the trick, is how do you inject the real sort of fear that and anxiety that comes with any scenario like that. That's the hard part. That's the challenge.
So when combat actually happens to you, that experience of fear and emotion, are you recognizing it in the moment, or are you somebody who compartmentalized, focused on what was in front of you, and then got back afterwards when it was more in a more secure area and went, holy shit, that was, we could have just died there?
No, I would say, I definitely, you feel those emotions in the moment, or at least I do. Yeah.
I remember feeling that when you talk about that level of nervousness, like the adrenaline hits you, not in the way that oh my God, I could run through a brick wall kind of adrenaline. It's the, I hope I don't crap my pants kind of adrenaline. I remember having that, but I also remember quickly putting that aside. And then when we got back to camp and sort of, went through an AAR or had to do the write-up on everything that happened for whatever reasons, that's when it sort of hit me a little bit more. And I was like, whoa, don't really want to experience that again if I don't have to.
Yeah, I think, again, I think what's interesting about that to me is that it applies in so many other scenarios to me. And again, moving forward as sort of a veteran, it's this so take that moment, any sort of combat type scenario, right? Is it mental in that scenario? Is it mental toughness that's really the issue there? I don't think it is. Because it's not okay, if there's a physical strain or something, I get it, but it's not really that. It's okay, adrenaline's up, fear is up, that whole kind of cycle is going. And so can you recognize it in that moment and sort of observe it objectively? And so that same idea to me applies to things like PTSD or any of these other mental issues that people deal with, right? It's that same concept. It's like there's thoughts going on right now. There's a reaction happening. And can I sort of separate myself from that and not allow it to be a detriment in the moment, right?
Yeah, I want to pause that because we're going to come back to it when we get to your personal stuff in a minute. But I wanted to proceed with these questions because I think it sort of builds the foundation for the rest of the conversation. Did you have conversations with any of your guys, or did they come to you and talk to you about the fear, about, what was going on? I know in that community, it's not a conversation that happens often, but I've talked to people who said, yeah, guys, I was scared. Guys came up to me and said they were scared, kind of deal. Those raw human emotions sometimes take over.
Yeah, I don't recall any conversation like that, honestly. I think that as a veteran, what I see is guys, again, we deal with stuff after the fact.
Right.
We're done with the military, and now we're trying to reconcile things, whatever that may be. And it can be a completely different scenario for people. But I think in high pressure jobs, what we tend to do, and again, I think this applies to all sorts of fields, and just even people in general, as sort of Americans, it's like we're not going to deal with any of that right now. We're going to tamp down. We're going to sort of suppress emotion, stuff it down, because that's what we have to do in the job. But then we're not going to process that later. We're not going to sort of go back to it and deal with it. And therein lies a lot of the issue, is we don't then go back and go, hey, you know what? Such and such scenario really bothered me a lot. And actually I'm having a tough time dealing with it. It's like, man, just going to try to tamp that and press it down, right?
Rub some dirt on it and get back in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
The benefit of hindsight, do you wish or think that if you had those conversations, after the moment or in the moment that you might have changed the outcome of not only yourself, but some of the people around you?
Yes, I do. And that is the thing that I'm trying to sort out, like how that could look, because in my mind, I think we could do a lot just as a society to be more mindful, be more present, be more aware, quite frankly, of our own mental workings ahead of time. I always tell people I didn't learn how to meditate until I was 45. And again, it was my only answer to any problem was suck it up. Suck it up and suffer in silence. That's the answer. And that makes a lot of sense in terms of mission execution. Like, yep. Got it. People's lives are on line. You're in a lot of pain. Suck it up. Suffer in silence. Like, keep going. Got it. That's the job. But post facto, after the fact, when you're dealing with like all this, whether it's survivor's guilt or PTSD or whatever it may be, like, not a good idea. Suck it up is not. But the problem is, it's the only tool a lot of us have. Like, we don't know how to do anything else. The only thing we know how to do, only thing I knew how to do was just to suck it up. And so like the thought of like having a conversation with somebody to say, hey, this really bothered me. I really feel this way. It's like, I don't do that. Like, that's not how I operate. And that is a paradigm that I think has to change.
I mean, the whole suck it up mentality, it's beat into us from day one, from the first day you put the uniform on, whether it's at the Naval Academy, basic training. I mean,
it's everywhere. It is. I mean, like, it's not just the military. I mean, how often do you see that basic message? Don't quit. That idea, right? Like, just whatever happens, don't quit. Good. Again, like, we need that message at times. I still need it. I'm sure you still need it too. There's times where I have to think, just suck it up. Right? Like, stop, don't, just suck it up. Right. But it's just not the only tool. And that, I think, is the difference.
From a role-playing game here, what do you think the conversation would have sounded like? Like, you guys just get back from a mission, or whatever, I mean, you sit you guys down and go, is everybody okay?
Well, yeah, I know what you're saying.
It would have been looked at like with three heads, like, sir.
No, I think it starts with like an individual approach. Like, again, I go back to a lot of what I have dealt with. It's not that I necessarily needed to talk to anyone else. What I needed was to be aware of my own thought process and understand what was going on in a way that I didn't have to identify with. That's the real difference. And again, I think that's where it doesn't have to be, let's all sit around and sing Kumbaya and talk about our feelings. I think we can be more open. Look, let's go back to sort of the sort of Viking example. I feel like, and I don't know if this is just sort of the Hollywood version of, but it was like these guys would have some big battle, and then they're all kind of sitting around, sort of recounting in a way that wasn't professional. It was more just like a celebration and like an openness, and they would like mourn the dead and stuff like that. Like, even the fact that we don't mourn people, that's a big piece of it too. Like, if you lose a teammate, you got to be able to mourn that. You have to be able to cry about that. It can't just be like, okay, let's just bury him and like move on, right? Okay, like in the actual, like, whatever the scenario is that you're dealing with, yeah, you got to, keep going, got it. But then there has to be the ability for people to emotionally process these things, and that's a big piece of it too. But anyway, getting back to your question there, I just think that we need some individual training in this arena, I think, where we just can start to recognize our own thought patterns. We can tap into what's going on in our own minds, and be able to sort of like examine it in a way that I don't think we do a very good job of normally.
Different conversation for a different day. The biggest problem is the military. They say openly they're okay with that conversation, but they're not. They don't know how to have it. They don't train on how to have it. They don't check up on people enough who need it to have those primal conversations about what you're feeling and how to get through this whole and the idea of, hey, I'm going to suck it up. I just need a minute first. Like I need to take a pause here. We don't do that in the military still. We say we do. We say, hey, you could have PTSD and still serve and everything else, but there's still a core group of, what is that personality chart? Like the IE.
Oh yeah. It's the,
all the generals sit in the top left.
Myers, it used to be Myers-Briggs. I think it's something else
right
now.
Well, but all the high level decision makers are all sitting in that same top corner, are all cut the same way, who live in groupthink and don't want any other invasion of the way they think. Like those aren't folks who are sitting there going, we probably need to start having more conversations about the health of our service members, the mental health of our service members. Like they're not ready for that yet.
Well, I just think that the trends you see are indicative. So, I'm not here to sort of disparage what the military does, but
I'm not either, but it's just
I think more. I think more sort of on a societal level where all the trends from a mental health perspective are not going in the right direction, and suicide rates are up, and they keep going up basically year over year. So those are the trends, and so you have to look at that and say, well, we obviously aren't doing something right, or we're not doing enough. And my thing is, again, I think it comes down to some level of an individual training modality, because someone who decides to take their own life, when that happens, we usually say things like, oh, it's weird. Like, we didn't know he was struggling so much. Or, if you're having problems, reach out to somebody. And those are good messages. But the reality is, when people make that decision, and if they go through with it, they're by themselves. By and large, most people don't take their own life in front of other people. It's usually they're by themselves somewhere, right? So, okay, how's that going to get interfered with? How is that going to get prevented by somebody else? It's not. It's only going to get prevented by that person being trained enough to understand what's going on and have a plan, basically, like an emergency plan for themselves. They're the only person that can save themselves in that moment. And I think that that's just an obvious reality that we have to deal with and work with.
100%. And I'll give a shout out to a former guest on the show and personal friend and mentor, Mike Jason, who is a retired colonel in the Army, but he has talked so much about former service members who have privately owned weapons is one of the biggest reasons. It's the accessibility in those moments to a weapon. If you take those weapons out of the equation, we prevent a lot more suicides, right? And he's not saying there should be gun restriction or anything else. He's just saying that, step one, get the weapon out of the house. You don't have to surrender to authority. Just get, if it's not there, it's another step in the process of killing yourself that you now have to clear with a face-to-face interaction with somebody. Hey, I need my gun back.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting, obviously, if you don't have a gun, it's really hard to use one, right? I mean, that's a really obvious thing. I think for a lot of gun owners, that's a big step to be don't have this. I think, though, there are other preventative measures that they could do to make it harder to get in the moment, even in their own home, right? And sure. But like that even
don't take that step. They don't double, triple, and secure. Here, you have the password. I don't have the password to the gun, right? Like, they don't take those steps. They make it readily accessible, which is the point to owning it, right?
Yeah. I think the challenge there is you still got to deal with the issue, right? So it's like, okay, we can take away the weaponry that would make this happen, but that still doesn't solve the problem, really. No, it might mitigate
the result factor.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's definitely.
I just put that out there because I think Mike is really smart with that, and it's a conversation we're not having enough about, veterans and privately owned weapons and how we're getting from point A to point B. But I was curious on your thoughts on it. You talked about loss before, and losing a teammate and everything else, and I'm not, if it happened to you or any of the guys that you were with. I'm curious how you looked at it then and how you look at it now.
Boy, that's a good question. Well, like I said, I think in the moment, you tend to sort of, okay, what needs to be done here? You have a very sort of logical mind, like, okay, what do we got to do here? Who do we need to take care of? Right? There's other people that need to be taken care of. There's family members that need to be taken care of. All of that, like a very pragmatic sort of continue mission idea. And that's important. That definitely needs to be done. Like I said, I think the issue is that we don't then look at how it's affecting us personally as well, and be very honest about that and able to deal with it. Look, some of the therapy that I've been through, different modalities, I ended up crying for like hours. I mean, hours, really intense stuff. And I didn't even know it was possible. Like like some of the sort of energy that I was expending from a sorrow standpoint was just off the charts. And it really opened my eyes to how much of that I had compartmentalized, suppressed, pushed down over years. And it hadn't gone anywhere. And that was a really big eye opener to me too. It's like, we sort of think that, okay, I feel like I'm going to cry right now for whatever reason. And I can kind of like resist that. And we think that just sort of dissipates, like it goes away. And the crude example,
just adding another more weight, more plate, and say putting another plate on top of the weight, right?
Yeah, and it's just not true. It literally, it's like your body has an energetic response that it's trying to make happen there, and it's not like it just vanishes. It gets tucked away somewhere. It's sort of the crude example I use is it's like holding in a fart, right? If you do that, it doesn't like vanish. Like eventually that's going to come out. And it's going to be like, the more you do that, it's more painful. It's toxic, right? And that's sort of disgusting. But I think it's a pretty good analogy.
It's a very good analogy.
You know, and so yeah, it's like I think now, obviously, like I mourn these guys appropriately and sort of think about them as appropriate and try to kind of keep their stories alive. All of that stuff. I think what I realize now is you have to figure out a way to process emotions properly in as close to real time as possible.
Sure.
And it's not always possible. And I get it.
No, that's fair. People need to understand in combat, there's not always time to do the mourning, right? Because there is,
of course not. Of course not.
Have to happen.
Yes.
The problem is that, you know, when you separate yourself time-wise from an event,
yeah,
obviously your emotions die down. You can rationalize, you can compartmentalize. Individuals can do a lot of different things to the same question from the day after it happened to a week after it happened to a month after it, because you just get more, you know, your brain cognitively will process it more and more differently with time. And so the answer is different. And so, you know, a week down the road, hey, you all right, is different than the day after it happened, which a month down the road, hey, you all right, is different than a week after it happened, right? I mean, it's just, that's natural. So, you know, the sort of acuteness of the emotion dissipates and you don't really get to it. That's the challenge, because people are like, no, I'm good. Like, honestly, I'm okay with it, you know, and you believe them because you live with these people day in and day out. You fight alongside of them. You trust them with your life. They trust you with theirs. And what reason do you have to doubt their word when they say, Chris, I'm good, you know?
Yeah.
Like, so you start, we talked about cycles before. You get into this cycle of never really attacking it in the moment when it is. For you, was there one particular loss that stood out more than another, or stung a little bit more, or sort of stayed with you a little bit longer than expected?
You know, I don't want to kind of.
I'm not asking you to rank them. I'm asking.
Yeah, right.
Look, I mean, again, we process things differently.
Yeah.
There may be a given reason why one stayed with you longer than another. And you don't have to, if you're not comfortable divulging the reasons, by all means, you don't have to. But I just, you know, trust me, I'm walking the dog here. I'll get you.
Yeah. No. I think they all kind of hit in different ways because I was involved in them in different ways, right? So there's ones where it was like where it was the first person I knew personally that we lost. That hit in a certain way. It depended on how I knew them too, whether it was someone I went through training with or someone I went to the Naval Academy with, because there were a couple of those, and like what the scenario was ahead of that. So how, if I had just spoken to them previously, right? Like those hit in different ways. Yeah. There was sort of the way we were dealing with it in certain ways back home too, like my involvement in sort of some of the after the things that need to be done with families. So those scenarios, they're all different. I will say I have a sort of an interesting scenario with a family death that was wrapped into all of that as well, where I was deployed and my father died of a heart attack suddenly. He was 59. And so I got this email from my wife that I don't even know how delayed it was. She could have written it a day prior or something. It wasn't like I was checking my email all the time. And just basically said, hey, you need to call me like immediately. And so I did. And she told me that my dad had passed away. And so that was and the last conversation I had with him was that he was going to be a grandfather. So my wife was pregnant with our first, and I just learned that a couple of weeks prior. And we'd had this kind of like three-way conversation that we managed to make work from me overseas to tell him this. And and then 2-3 weeks later, he died. And so that was the last conversation I had. And so I had to kind of like upend everything, go home, deal with all that, then go back overseas to finish things out, and then go home. And then my son was born like 3 months later or something like that. That whole scenario for me, I think, was a huge emotional roller coaster that I didn't properly deal with at the time. I couldn't, but I definitely didn't. And I think that was a real emotional drain on me. And I think what's interesting too is like you're trying not to be like, woe is me. I mean, that's another piece of it, right? It's like, everyone deals with stuff. Everyone's got problems, and you're like, hey, my problems are not any worse than anyone else's. And so because of that, you're sort of like trying to be tough and all that, and be like, don't feel sorry for me or anything. But was that hard? Yeah, it was hard. That was really tough.
I can imagine, especially you shed a little light on the relationship you had with your dad. That's got to be gut wrenching, to say the least. So my condolences. Obviously,
I mean, look,
I know it was a long time ago, but
yeah,
still, my heart broke a little bit for you hearing that. Like I just wasn't expecting to hear it. So, that moment aside, looking back, when we talk about sort of PTS and when you look back on it and you sort of recount your own timeline, was there a specific moment or a seminal moment or anything where you realize that might have been where I took a turn that I was not able to come back from?
Yes. Oh, I know exactly what it was.
Can you share some of that?
Yeah, I'll give you sort of the vague. Again, I don't like turning it into a war story. So the broad brush. Here's the broad brush version is that I committed a tactical error. So I screwed up, like basically in the field, in a way that I essentially couldn't forgive myself for. And I refer to it as a sort of like a Bill Buckner moment. And do you know who Bill Buckner is?
I grew up in New York. Yeah, I know who Bill
Okay. So
I'm a Yankees fan, not a Met fan, but still
okay. But yeah, so
he was part of the nightmare of my childhood because the Mets won a World Series in my lifetime before the Yankees did. So
okay. So you have an interesting perspective on it. So people that don't know, Bill Buckner was the first baseman for the Red Sox in the World Series in 1986.
You're a Boston. You mentioned this.
Yeah, I'm a Boston dude, right? So this was like a big moment of my childhood. Like I remember this so well.
The seminal moments, dear Lord.
Yeah, exactly. So he was the first baseman for the Red Sox, 86 World Series against the Mets. And the Red Sox hadn't won since they traded away Babe Ruth. That's the curse of the Bambino. And it was game 6. It was extra innings. They were tied. They were actually going to win. And then Bob Stanley threw a wild pitch, and there's a whole bunch that went into it. But it was tied, and there was 2 outs. and Mookie Wilson hits this grounder down the first base line, and Bill Buckner, all he has to do is like scoop it. It's like routine grounder. All he has to do is pick it up, step on the bag, inning over, Red Sox are back up at bat. And if they win the game, they win the World Series. But the ball went through his legs. He flubbed the play. And because of that, Ray Knight, who was on second base, scored the winning run. Mets win, and then they won Game 7 as well. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that went into why the Red Sox didn't win. That game, the other games, the manager made some bad decisions. Again, Bob Stanley threw a wild pitch, all this stuff. But everybody remembers Bill Buckner. It was like and it became laser focused on Bill Buckner lost the World Series for us. And I'm sure that was awful for him. But for me, it felt like that kind of a moment where like on a very like, this can be the greatest moment of your life. Like it ended up being the worst. And because of that, I just spent an inordinate amount of time thinking, like turning this into a story that was like that. That was a story about failure. That was a story about you're a loser. You are an embarrassment. Everyone else thinks that about you too. Putting thoughts in other people's heads that probably weren't there. And that snowballed on itself and just got worse and worse and worse. And I did that for 12 years.
Wow.
After the military, where it was like a daily part of my existence. And my self-worth completely changed. And so, yeah, there is a very clear like scenario that did that to me. And what's so amazing to me now is I think back on that and it's like, it's all self-inflicted. And it was basically PTSD. Like PTSD, I think, is an interesting thing. Like we try to turn it into this, I hate disorder and disease and illness. Like we turn it into something that's like a pathogen, like you caught it. I even see that where it's like, hey, take this test to find out if you have PTSD. Like it's right? Like it's a bacteria or something. Yeah. And it's like, okay, well, what is PTSD? Fundamentally, it is basically thinking about something over and over and over again that bothers you, right? It's a memory that bothers you. And the thing that I finally learned was it wasn't the memory that was the problem. It was the story I was telling myself about it. It was the why I was trying to put on it, like this like narrative I was crafting around it. Because once I changed that narrative, the PTSD went away. Like it doesn't bother me. It just doesn't. And the memory's still there. Like I remember all this stuff. Again, people's memory isn't all that great. So there's details of this that I'm sure are not even accurate at this point. But the point is like that I was essentially making a choice that it would bother me. And that's so hard to wrap your head around. I've met veterans, Vietnam veterans, who are self-admitted PTSD sufferers, and they say, they hate that stuff. It just never goes away. And I'm like, yeah, the memory, what you remember will not go away. However, the way you react to it, the story you're telling yourself, even that piece, this will never go away, is a story. That's a decision you've made. And that, I think, it was such an important thing for me to realize. And I learned it through a treatment called EMDR, which involves these kind of like paddles, and you work with a therapist. And that completely changed my perspective on this. But I think having learned that from the EMDR treatment, I think I could have done it without the EMDR. Like, I mean, I don't know that like somehow altered my brain or something like that. Maybe it did. But I think fundamentally, if I had just been able to realize you were just telling yourself a story. And here's the other part. You are putting that story in other people's minds where it doesn't exist. Like you think all these people are thinking about you and they're not. They're thinking about themselves. They're doing what you're doing. And that's something that it's such an interesting psychological thing about human beings is we think about ourselves all day long, and we only really think about other people in the context of wondering what they're thinking about us, not realizing that they're doing the exact same thing, right? They think about us in the context of what we think about them. And if we would all come to that realization, we would just sort of realize, yeah, there's not a lot of people spending much energy judging you or thinking about you or worrying about your past mistakes. They're worried about themselves,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's interesting because, the PTSD component of this whole thing that you carried with you for all those years through active duty into the Naval Reserves and everything.
Yeah.
12 years from that event, which spans the time you had finished your military career, correct?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
I mean, I wonder, because after your military career, look, we go down your resume. I mean, you've done some pretty incredible things. You founded a CrossFit gym in the Virgin Islands. You get hired as a president of a company. It was a Fortune, not a Fortune 500 company, but one of the Killcliff, the fastest growing beverage brand in the U.S. back in 2015. You did a business to business team, tripled Amazon sales. Like you're doing high performance, high level work.
Yes.
All while sort of carrying this heavy pack with you.
Yep.
Everywhere.
Yep.
I preface all that by saying, because I wonder this in my own head about my own personal story. Can you use your PTSD as a motivator to now try and perform at a better level to sort of make up for, and I air quote the word mistake.
Yep. No, that's fine.
But just whatever you dealt with up for whatever trauma it was.
Yep.
Do you think that's what you were doing?
That's a really good question. I think potentially it was compensatory in that regard, like what you're saying. I've never really thought about it in that way. I think I compartmentalized it and always been kind of a high performer.
To be frank, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but to be frank, it's not a question. I ask you specifically because I know your background and I see the level that you perform at, and it's natural to me that for somebody who would make an error, as you called it, tactical error, the only way to, if you can't fix the error, well, next time we just double it up and like we're going to prove to everybody that the error was isolated. It was a one-off instance, and this isn't how we perform. So now we're going to perform even higher. Yeah,
and I think that's probably, whether I thought about that consciously or if it was a subconscious thing, I think that definitely had something to do with it. I think it had a lot to do with my sort of giving, like I need to give back, right? I need to do more for this community. I think it had something probably to do with that as well. And it goes back to the sort of suck it up and suffer in silence thing, right? It's like, just keep driving on, just keep trying to like outperform everything and suck up this component of things. And then don't really deal with it. Or just don't figure out a way to deal with it, So yeah, that's an interesting thought. I think that probably was true.
Well, I think about it for myself. It's like with my own personal story and my trauma and what I've dealt with. I often say to myself when I'm having a bad emotional day or something with work has frustrated me or life or whatever, I often have to remind myself of the shit that I was in downrange. And I say to myself, you've survived worse.
Mm-hmm.
Today will pass. Deal with it. Just remember, you've stood in, for the sake of drama, you've stood in the pits of hell and you walked out of it. Today is not as bad as that day. Mm-hmm. So I sort of use it as a motivator for myself. And I don't know if that's healthy or not, to be honest with you, because some of that pulls you back into that mindset where everything is a fight and everything is a challenge and everything is survival. And, you twist your mind into thinking that I now have to do this on my own because I'm the only one standing here. And that's sort of that suffer in silence mentality that you keep referencing that is more of a detriment than a help to us.
No, I think it can be both. I mean, I think it completely depends on the scenario. It's one thing to say, hey, look, this is challenging right now, but I've undergone, I've endured worse.
Past other crucibles, right?
I've endured worse, so I can make it through this. I think that's totally healthy. It's different if you're stewing on whatever that past thing was. That's a different scenario where then you got to be like, okay, dealing with now, good. And referencing like, hey, I've been through harder things, good. I think all that is good. If it's dealing with this thing now, simultaneously I'm stewing on the thing and that's making me think of like what a screw up I was back then, or like making me think of this trauma that happened to me in my life. That's where I think it's damaging, where you got to sort of stop yourself and say, why am I doing that? Like, what?
Sure.
Right? What am I doing here and why? I think is crucial.
I asked you before about the seminal moment that you knew that things had taken a turn.
Yeah.
Flip side, when you're out, what was the moment you realized, hey, I'm not 100%, or hey, I need to get help, or hey, I need to have this conversation with somebody?
I think there were a number of times where, I understood pretty early on that something was not good, or that things were going in a direction where I didn't know what to do, didn't know. So you're talking about sort of that whole sort of snowballing of regret and guilt and all that was the last kind of 5 years of active duty time. And it got to the point where for me, it turned into a health anxiety thing. So I went from sort of regretting these things, feeling shame, feeling guilty. Hey, there's also a whole bunch of guys that didn't make it that were better than you, better performers, better SEALs, better men in my estimation. So, but you're still around, they're not. That's not fair. Therefore, sort of cosmically, karmically, you should probably die of something. It must be something that's going to take you out. And so I would start kind of looking for that. I became obsessed with like lab tests and things like that. Any sort of sensation I had in my body I would think that that's the beginning of some, like a heart attack, started having panic attacks. And there's a whole system where this, like your limbic system, that if you do that and you feed it more danger signals, just makes the whole thing worse. So I got to the point where I couldn't even like function some days, where I'd be super dizzy and brain foggy and tremors and mock heart attacks and you name it. Right around that time where I was getting off active duty. And it got so bad that I came home one night from work and I drove up to our townhome, and my wife was doing personal training in the garage, and she looked at me and she was, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "No, I'm not." And I walked up to our front steps, to our front door, and I just fell down, and I was like just sitting there crying on the front steps. And my son, who was 3 or 4 at the time, walked up behind me. I think he was in the garage with my wife, and he just looked at me and he was trying to process what was going on. Like it didn't make any sense to him. And so he looked up and down the street and looked back at me and he said, "Daddy, there's no monsters out here." And in his mind, I was like afraid of monsters. Like it was the only thing he could figure out, right? It was like, that's a storybook type of thing. And I looked back at him and I pointed at my head and I said, "No, buddy, the monsters are in here." And that moment still gets me a little choked up, because the thing was, I understood that a lot of what was going on, I was doing to myself. I just didn't know what to do about it. Like I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know. And I was ashamed to talk to anybody about it. So I just kept it to myself. And I operated that way for years after the fact. And then there were many other moments after that too, where things got really low, and I came down with a chronic illness in 2016, and that made things even worse. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been a tough road. I mean, I'm past most of that now. I still claw my way out of it, but doing much better on a day-to-day basis.
No, and again, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, it's, recounting those moments sometimes, as I've said repeatedly, sometimes the flashbacks are worse than the actual event, right? Like the remembering how you reacted in those moments sometimes eats you up a little bit more because you wish you had a better reaction.
Well, and that's the problem, right? It's that idea that is the issue. That I wish I'd had a bit, all of that. What we really fail to realize is when we think of traumatic stuff, the trauma we use kind of trauma in a couple different contexts. We use it as the event. We can use it as sort of like physical damage that happens to us, or we talk about it in terms of sort of this lingering effect, ongoing problems. But from an acute standpoint, any trauma, whatever it is, whether it's something we did that we regret, whether it's something that was done to us or something we witnessed, is gone. It's like no longer in existence, right? Like that thing is not here anymore in any way, shape, or form. The only way it's here is in our memory. And what's the problem is our reaction to that memory. It's that kind of stuff. It's like, I wish this had been different. That's the problem, not the memory. And it's getting past that to just understanding, well, it's not going to be different, And so you can either spend your time saying that over and over again, or you can say something else. And that's tricky. It's not easy, but it is simple. And I think that that's a really important thing for us all to understand and try to figure out for ourselves.
You say that, you've moved on. I'm curious, just, for you personally, between mourning the loss of your teammates or the tactical error or whatever, how much of this creeps into your consciousness still on a daily basis?
Very little, very little. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I can talk about it now and I'm okay with that. I wouldn't have been able to do that 9 years ago. So it's, again, I can recount all of this stuff. I can remember it to the extent that the memories are accurate. The difference is that it doesn't bother me. It just doesn't bother me. I've made the choice that it's not going to bother me. And that's the difference.
I mean, I love the sentiment. I wonder how you get to a spot where you say, this isn't going to bother me. It's, that's personally me. I don't know if I'm cut that way. There are things that bother me that they freaking bother me. And you ask why, I don't know why. It just bothers me. And I want it to bother me because sometimes me being bothered by this feels better.
Well, okay. And that's a very honest thing to say, right? I would say that that's a choice to say, well, I want this to bother me.
Yeah.
I even think the statement you said, that's just the way I am. I often think about that too. I think we succumb to that line of thinking often. There are things about me that are the way I am. I am 5'8". I have blue eyes. I have brown hair that's getting grayer by the moment. Those things are the way I am, for sure. I can't do anything to change that. However, I think the way that we operate, the way we think, our patterns of behavior, can those things change? Yeah, they can. And I go back to this, my own circumstance. If I can spend 12 years beating myself up over a memory and telling a story and change that completely, well, then you can do that. That can be done. Mm-hmm. And some of it is believing it can be done, because if every day you don't believe that can happen, well, guess what? It's never going to happen. And that's a big piece of it. If you believe you are a certain way and that's the way you're always going to be, yeah, that's the way you're always going to be.
Don't make me change myself now. I'm just so comfortable being.
You don't have to. But the point is you can. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I often think about well, could I wake up tomorrow and act completely differently? Act could I wake up tomorrow and act like you and basically be you?
You don't want to do that.
Maybe not. But is it possible? I think it probably is. Again, not easy, but I think there's a lot of things that we take for granted as thinking we are pre-programmed in certain ways, where what we're really doing is making choices. And we've made that choice so many times that it's become a pattern of behavior. But that's not to say we couldn't start choosing something different and change that pattern. And I think that's really important. I mean, just like anything else you can learn. You can learn, how old are you? I'm 40, I'm almost 48. How old are you about to?
45, yeah.
45. So you could start learning a skill tomorrow that you've never learned in your life. I don't know what that is for you, but a musical instrument, archery, BJJ, these are decisions we don't have to just learn these things as kids. And that changes something about what we know, about the way we operate, about a skill. And so I think some of this stuff of when we think it's this is me, I think you can think about it more like it's a skill. The way your patterns of behavior are like skills. And so learn a new skill, think of it that way.
Yeah, there's a very short list of people who want to wake up in the morning and act like me.
Yeah, I'm probably not on that list either.
Party of one, yes, that's me. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Table is waiting. Okay, so you've moved on from the military. Again, I talked about some of the things that you went on to do. I want to hit two more things within, your personal life. One, you end up the communications director of the Navy SEAL Foundation. Now, I know that Killcliff had a partnership with the Navy SEAL Foundation, and a lot of their profits or proceeds or whatever it was from Killcliff sales went to the Navy SEAL. Is that how you ended up connecting the two?
Still do. Yeah. That partnership is still in existence. And yes, basically when I was the president of Killcliff, Todd Ehrlich, who is the founder of that company, who's a SEAL as well, that was his mission from the get-go, was he wanted to be the largest contributor to the Navy SEAL Foundation. He wanted that company to do that. Whether it ever got there or not wasn't really important. What was important was that the company had a nonprofit mission, even though it was a for-profit company, and that it was willing to really dive in there and support the community. So when I came on board, we were able to get an audience with the foundation leadership and make that happen. So on paper, we were the first corporate partner. There are plenty of companies that had given lots of money to the foundation, but we were the first ones who were like, we're going to put the logo on our packaging. We're going to sort of do this on a month-to-month basis where we've got a contract in place. And look, it was a great honor. It's been a great honor. Like, to date, the Killcliff has given over $1 million in terms of cash and free drinks and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, that's kind of what got me the relationship with the foundation. So when I left Killcliff, I was lucky enough to get the role at the foundation, I think, because we established a relationship there.
And I think it's great. Again, having been fortunate to be close enough to both Killcliff, as an organization, and knowing a lot of people who work there, their commitment to the Navy SEAL Foundation is extensive, and I'm glad it's still there. Also, I know you talked about your show and everything else, but you have your own brand called Rare Sense.
Yep.
Tell me why you started this, and how much of this is still part of your own self-recovery, your own self-journey.
Yeah. I started it because of all these things I talked about. I finally got to this point where I got so low in terms of my own mental health and chronic illness, where late 2019, I almost took my own life, and or at least I was seriously thinking about it.
Right.
And in that, it was kind of this moment. It was right before Christmas, 2019. It was just like I couldn't think. I mean, I was in so much pain all the time and couldn't think, and just was so hopeless that I was kind of curled in a ball on the floor of my kitchen in my wife's arms, crying. It was just like, I gotta just take my own life. I didn't do that, obviously, and instead I just took this picture of myself on my phone, and it was for the exact reason you said earlier. I wanted something to show my future self, you got through this, and it's whatever you're dealing with now is not this bad. And then there was, it's sort of a long story, but there were things that I learned out of that, changed my attitude a little bit, changed my approach to a more self-centered, I'm going to own this, I'm going to train my way out of this, and had made enough improvement in a year where I posted that picture on Instagram. And man, I was so hesitant to do it. It took me days to have the courage to do that. Again, because I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I didn't want to be a woe is me. But my thought was, all right, if somebody sees this and they're thinking about doing the same thing, maybe they won't. Maybe somebody won't take their own life because of what I'm talking about. And I got a lot of good feedback from that, from veterans, from fellow teammates, from other people, friends, that they were really encouraging about it. And so I thought, okay, maybe I should do some more of this. So I just kind of started doing some of that on social media. And then GoRuck actually gave me a little blog where I was writing some mental health stuff. It was called Mind Matters. And then I was on a flight and I saw the movie Logan, about kind of old man Wolverine with Hugh Jackman as this broken down superhero. And I'd seen it before, but watching it a second time, it struck me how much the character was like me. It was like a special operations veteran. He was broken down. He's drinking too much. His mind's not working all that well. He's all beat up and broken. And I just thought that juxtaposition really hit home for me. So I wrote this article about it, just saying that basically, and just expressing some of the way I felt. And I wrote it on a Word document, just sitting on a plane, and I didn't know what to do with it. I'm like, what do I do with this? It was like an expression where I just wanted to get it out. And then I was like, well, I've heard about Substack, which is where independent journalists kind of publish things as a newsletter blog. I'm like, well, I guess I'll put it on Substack. So I started a Substack account and I published this article called Logan. And then I on social media, my very small social media following said, hey, I wrote this article, like, check it out. And again, a lot of people were like, hey, this is really good, write more of this. So it just grew from there. And I just decided, okay, I'm going to sort of share lessons learned from a mental health perspective, really taking ownership and turning it into a training modality about mind fitness and expanding on that. So for a while, I was just writing an article every month. Then I started recommending a book along with it, which was usually tied to whatever the subject of the article was, something I'd read, which I thought was really helpful. Then I added a podcast to it where I'm talking to either mental health experts or a lot of veterans who now work in the space in various ways, like they're counselors or therapists or something like that, or different modalities. And then I finally got to the point where I started doing a weekly training too. So now every Sunday I publish a weekly mind training workout. It's like a mind workout, basically, where it's sort of introducing a modality or a mix of modalities for people to work on their own that week. And the whole idea is to open people's eyes to what's available and figure out what works for them. Because my path was that. It was trial and error of there's a gazillion things out there that you can try. You got to try them. You got to figure out what works for you and create your own regimen, just like you would do with your body. And what works for me might not be what works for you or works for somebody else. And that's fine. That's the way things are. The same way, like you and I won't work out exactly the same way. Our diets aren't exactly the same. It's the same idea. So it's all published under Rare Sense now. And it's free. It's a free resource. It's just trying to help. It's mainly directed at kind of veterans or people like them, with first responders. Yeah.
If Chris, the founder of Rare Sense, had a chance to cross paths with Chris Irwin, the Navy SEAL team leader who made a tactical error, what would he say to him in those moments after?
Yeah, so that's exactly the point. Is he would say, hey, you got to start injecting all of this kind of stuff into your training, so to speak. You need to adopt a mental training regimen the way you're so committed to your physical training regimen. Like, you know how to work out, you get after it every day, you push your body, you push through physical discomfort, all of that. You have got to adopt some stuff to balance that out mentally. And interconnect them too. I mean, that's the other thing. These aren't separate disciplines. There's not mental and physical. It's a mind-body thing. Like I was saying, everything is ultimately mental, and that's because it's all tied together. It's just an experience. And so, yeah, he would say, hey, 20 years ago, dude, start doing this stuff now. And that way you would never have ended up where you were. Or at least if you did, you would be way more equipped to deal with it. It's not that there's not going to be setbacks in your life. It isn't going to be perfect. Obviously, that's not the point. But that's what he would have done.
How much of what you're doing now with Rare Sense is as much still about keeping your skills sharp for your own mental health as it is about helping others?
Yeah, I think it's part of it for sure. And there's a reward there for me, certainly, in feeling like I'm helping people. Anytime somebody's like, oh, this was great. This really, I didn't think about this way. That's very rewarding to me. So yeah, it's a mix of both for sure, because I'm still at it. I mean, that's the other thing is, I don't like the idea of being some guru or something. I think that there's a lot of people out there that come at anything with a, hey, I'm amazing, and look at all the kick-ass shit I did, and you can do it too. And look at how epic I am. I'm sort of like, well, I've tried a lot of things. I've got a lot of lessons learned from that. I'd like to share those lessons, but I'm still on the journey. And it is a journey. It's a journey in the same way that your physical fitness is a journey. Every day, you got to wake up and make a decision to eat well or eat shit, or work out or not work out. And that's going to determine the way you feel the next day. And like that determines your trajectory. It's the same thing with your mind. You never win. There's no finish line. It's just a question of, are you engaged in the process? And is the process either keeping you where you want to be or making improvements on a day-to-day basis?
You mentioned about suffering in silence, and I would argue that a lot of us veterans would admit we are absolutely suffering in silence.
Yeah.
Acknowledge that, yes, I'm struggling, but I'm just not going, I haven't talked to anybody about it. What would you say to those people who are willfully suffering in silence, and not sure how to take that first step to talk to somebody?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, do something about it. Check out the content I'm putting out. If nothing else, start kind of learning how to be mindful, like learning about what's going on with your mind and how you don't have to like identify with it. I mean, I think that's step one. Two is like, yeah, figure out who you talk to, somebody about it. And it doesn't have to be a therapist even. It can be a friend. I mean, I think you'll find one of the reasons why I wanted to do what I was doing was because like I wanted to provide an example of like just being open, like I started talking basically to nobody, essentially just to the internet of like, here's what I'm dealing with, and people don't have to do that. They don't have to make it public. But what I wanted to demonstrate through that was that the you're not alone message that you hear a lot, I wanted to enact that, because it's one thing to just see some meme that says you're not alone. Okay. It's a different thing to say, here's me, like, here's all the fucked up stuff that I deal with. And like, it's perfectly okay to talk about it, like through action, right? By trying to be that example. So figure out a way to do that on your own, whatever, but like I said, I mean, I provide all that content so that people can find that path the way that works for them. And it's not going to be the same for everybody. So you got to figure that out. But I do think that that's important. You got to take ownership of it. It's your mind. No one can force you to think something other than you. And so you have to take ownership of it and think of it in that way. You're not a victim of something. You are the owner of your own mind. So own it.
Songwriter, score, musician, Murph. Out of curiosity, did you ever cross paths with Mike? I mean,
nope.
You're older than
no,
he is, right?
No, I never met him.
Yeah, I mean, all I know, we're both Long Island boys, so
Yep, right, yeah.
Best connection I have to him. But I mean, was there any particular inspiration behind writing that and doing it?
Yeah, I can tell you the story quickly, and I'm sorry, I have to bounce here in about 5 minutes.
Don't worry about it. What was the last thing I got for you, Chris?
No, I just want to make sure that you knew I do have a hard stop, but I'm sorry I have to cut it short. So the guy who made that film, Scott McTavish, he had made another documentary called Ride for Lance, which was about Lance Vaccaro, who was a SEAL who was killed in training. And that movie was about these guys, friends, teammates, who did a motorcycle rally in his honor from Virginia Beach to Alaska and back. And those guys were really good friends. I knew Lance, but I knew them better. They were good friends of mine. And so when I learned about that and he was looking for money to make the movie, I was like, well, I'll give you some money. I don't have money, but like I would like to support these guys and what they're doing and do this in Lance's honor. But then I asked him, I'm like, can I write a song for the movie? And this guy doesn't know me at all. And I think he was like, because I was giving him money, I think he was like, okay, sure. Not expecting much, but he liked the song that I wrote and recorded. And so it's in the film at the end. And so when the Murph thing came around and he was it's actually how I got connected to Todd at Killcliff, was he was looking for investors for that. Somehow I got linked up with Todd. Todd asked him for some SEAL references. He knew two, one of them was me, and therefore Todd called me up and to vouch for this and blah, blah, blah. But I said, okay, can I try to write the whole soundtrack for this movie? And he was like, sure. Yeah. You want to give that? And I think after that conversation, I realized, oh my God, I've got to write a whole soundtrack. Like, I don't even know if I can do that. So I called my buddy, Jeff Wiedenhofer, who is a good friend of mine from the Naval Academy. He's a phenomenal musician, Broadway musician, post-military, like really, he was a helicopter pilot. And then he was a Broadway guitarist for a decade. He's incredible. And I said, I need help. I need you to do this with me because I don't think I can do it on my own. And he was like, oh, I was the Keiko for the Murphy family. He was the guy like who went to the house in uniform for the Murphys. Wow. And I was like, what? Really? And so, yeah, it was one of those just kind of like the stars aligned somehow. And so he knew the family very well. He'd spent all this time with them. So that's what we did. So we co-wrote the soundtrack. We spent a lot of time working on it in New York, and did the best we could and recording things in our basements. And but I mean, I think we came up with a pretty good product, and we were just, obviously trying to honor the family and his memory. So
excellent stuff. Well, look, you made it through a whole show, and look, you didn't.
I did. Yeah, it was great. It was great.
Have to tell one war story, and I told you weren't going to have to. I told you there was a story to tell without getting into any of that.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was great. Look, that stuff I love talking about in terms of the kind of after effects and for sure.
That's a big part of what the Hazard Ground is about. It was never intended to be this sort of mental health conversation, but it evolved into that because of so many of us who are dealing with it. And I'm not where I am on my personal journey without this show, because I've talked to so many people about it. When you hear enough people be willing to share it, you start to realize, like, okay, yeah, I'm relating to everything you're saying, and I feel the same things. And maybe it's time that we go have some conversations we weren't ready to have before. But again, in all seriousness, Navy SEAL Foundation, obviously you can get in touch with you there as a communications director. Rare Sense is the place where they can get it, and the Substack where they can get all of the content that you're putting out. And look, it's great to finally reconnect with you again.
Yeah.
Loved it. Let's stay in touch. I hope to hear from you more. I will certainly check out Rare Sense and all the content there. And thanks for the time, man. I really, really appreciate it. It's been great.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate it.
Chris Irwin, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zinno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.